Welcome to Healthy Politics, a self-help channel for those who live in failing democracies. If we tried really hard to imagine the absolutely worst thing that could happen to a democracy, we still would not even come close to what actually happened in the Weimar Republic, Germany's first experiment in democratic government. What started as a republic with one of the world's most democratic constitutions turned into a totalitarian state bent on war and genocide. The Weimar Republic lasted 14 and a half years, from 1918 to 1933. A lot happened during that time, so it's helpful to break up those years into three fairly distinct periods. A difficult birth from 1918 to 1923, when Germany was ruled by a left and center coalition. The happy 20s, 1924 to 1929, when Germany was governed mostly by center-right politicians. And the beginning of the end, or the rise of the authoritarian right from 1930 to 1933. The early part of 1918 gave the German government good reason to be optimistic about their prospects for victory in World War I. Russia, their main opponent on the Eastern Front, had fallen victim to an ongoing communist revolution and sued for peace on terms that were very favorable for the Germans. On the Western Front, the German army had launched a successful offensive that got them within 50 miles of Paris. But as the year progressed, things started to look less rosy for Germany's monarch, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and his army. Military defeats in smaller theaters of war and political shifts on the Eastern Front meant Germany was starting to lose access to food and oil. On the Western Front, America's entry into the war meant that German troops had to confront new battalions of soldiers. Things went from bad to worse, and on September 29, 1918, General Erich Ludendorff and Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg of the German Supreme Army Command informed the Kaiser that the war was lost. Remember those two names, Ludendorff and Hindenburg. They play important roles later on. The Kaiser was advised to ask for an armistice. This was very different from what happened at the end of World War II, when Germany unconditionally surrendered. In this case, the Kaiser was supposed to only ask for cessation in fighting. He was further advised to turn over the reins of government to Parliament, which during the war had been an ineffective political institution in what was otherwise a military dictatorship. The German military leadership thought that they could get better terms on a peace treaty if it moved to a democratic government that might appease the Americans. Also, by handing the reins to a democratic government, which would have to negotiate a peace treaty, the military establishment could avoid blame for essentially losing the war. Initially, the German establishment had hoped for a constitutional monarchy, but then a series of uncontrollable events made this impossible. Though the war was lost, Germany had not yet signed an armistice. Naval officials had decided to launch a last-ditch naval battle against a much stronger British Navy. German soldiers on these ships had no intention of sacrificing themselves for the honor of their superiors. Instead, on November 3, 1918, they mutinied in what came to be known as the Kiel Sailors' Revolt. The rebellion quickly spread across the country, with participants demanding the Kaiser step down and the country become a democracy. On November 9, three important things happened. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. Philipp Scheidemann of the Social Democratic Party, the largest party in Parliament, declared Germany to be a republic, and on exactly the same day, Marxist revolutionary Karl Liebknecht declared a socialist republic. 2 days later, a new government represented by the Social Democratic Party and the Catholic Center Party signed the armistice. More specifically, it was signed by Matthias Erzberger, something he would later pay for with his life. While the shooting had technically stopped, the terms of the future peace treaty had not yet been determined. Many on the German side had unrealistic expectations about what the peace treaty might look like, but were hopeful that with a democratic government, the Americans would convince their allies to go easy on them. Things moved quickly and chaotically for the new republic. On January 5, 1919, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg led the Spartacist Uprising, a communist revolt that aimed to place a Soviet Union-style government in Germany. This is something that neither those who supported the Democratic Republic nor those who sought to return Germany to a right-wing autocracy wanted. The new democratic government had earlier made a deal to leave the military hierarchy alone in return for having their support. Now they needed their help with suppressing the revolt. A combination of regular army units and right-wing paramilitary forces called Freikorps were enlisted by the democratic government to crush the revolt. 1 week later, after hundreds had died, the democratic government was victorious, but at the cost of collaborating with anti-democratic right-wing paramilitaries. Rather than putting Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg on trial for treason, the democratic government had them assassinated. During April 1919, a second communist uprising took place in the German state of Bavaria. This one involved the participation of Russian communists and had the blessing of Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin. Eventually, it was also crushed by the Freikorps and the army and resulted in the execution of 1,000 to 2,000 communists. Now it was time for the Republic to hammer out a peace treaty with Germany's former enemies. After months of unsuccessful negotiating, the German Republic's government saw no choice but to sign the Treaty of Versailles on June 28, 1919, or face occupation by the victorious powers. Perhaps the only thing that all parties in Germany's hyperpolarized society could agree on was that the treaty was unrealistically onerous and unfair. Under the terms of the treaty, Germany would have to give up its overseas empire, return territory it had gained in the East, and pay burdensome reparations to its former enemies. Only a year earlier, it had looked like Germany would come out of the war victorious. Now they would be, in the words of the German Republic's first president, Friedrich Ebert, the wage slaves of other countries for 20, 40, or 60 years. This sharp contrast ultimately gave rise to the stab-in-the-back myth, which blamed Germany's loss not on those who conducted the war, but rather socialists, communists, supporters of the Republic, and Jews. We normally associate this idea with the Nazis, but it was prevalent even before the Nazis had started as a political movement. In spite of the Republic's early instability, only 1 week after the Spartacist uprising, an election was held to select delegates to a constitutional convention to determine how the new republic would be run. The convention took place in the small but cultured town of Weimar, Germany, far from Berlin, the chaotic capital. Fortunately, 3 parties committed to a democratic future won a large majority of the delegates. There was the Social Democratic Party, also known by its German acronym SPD. They had left-wing social and economic agenda, but they were committed to democratic principles. Then there was the German Democratic Party, also known as the DDP. The Catholic Center Party was united by its support of the Catholic Church and its socially conservative values, but its members' commitment to a democratic republic varied. The 3 parties would work together in 1919 to form the Weimar Coalition, which would successfully craft a constitution that was considered at the time to be one of the most progressive in the world. On August 11, 1919, the Weimar Constitution became the law of the land. Among other things, it gave men and women over the age of 21 the right to vote, and also gave workers the right to collectively bargain. It also made the state responsible for the welfare of mothers, children, and the unemployed. But there were also flaws in the Weimar Constitution that would later lead to its demise and to the rise of Adolf Hitler. The system was similar to the parliamentary governments we see today in Europe and other parts of the world. The legislature was elected through proportional representation, meaning that parties would be allocated seats in the Reichstag, or German parliament, based on how many votes they received in legislative elections. At the head of the government was the chancellor, who would work for the Reichstag. The new German government also had a president who was elected every 7 years directly by the people. His role was to name the chancellor and the cabinet. In cases where a clear majority of the Reichstag agreed on chancellor, this was largely a ceremonial role. However, things could get trickier in instances when this was not the case. In the case of a national emergency, the president could also grant the chancellor the power to govern by decree. Put more simply, if the German nation were under extreme duress, the president had the legal power to temporarily make the chancellor a dictator of sorts. The Weimar Republic was now a true constitutional democracy, but more trouble lay ahead. On March 13, 1920, a group of extreme right-wing military officers angry that the government had tried to disband two of the most powerful Freikorps regiments, marched into Berlin, where troops supposedly loyal to the government refused to fire on current and former military personnel, whom they considered comrades. The official government of the Republic then fled. This coup attempt came to be known as the Kapp Putsch, named after the insurrection's leaders. In an attempt to keep the coup from being successful, the official government called on German workers to instigate a general strike, which they did. Suddenly, the coup plotters could do nothing, with bureaucrats unwilling to follow their orders and newspapers unwilling to relay their messages. After much negotiation, the plotters stepped down and went into exile or were offered amnesty. However, in Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, the worker uprising had turned into a successful communist revolt, which was once again violently put down with the Freikorps. Finally, after almost a month, some calm returned to Germany, though the next year saw the assassination of Matthias Erzberger, the Catholic Center Party minister who had signed the armistice. 1 year later, in 1922, the newly elected government's foreign minister, Walter Rathenau, who also happened to be Jewish, was assassinated by violent anti-Semites. Many Germans saw Rathenau as a martyr for democracy, and his death was commemorated every year until the Nazis took power. While it looked like the political situation couldn't get any worse, Germany's economy was about to enter an epic tailspin. Inflation had been a problem in Germany since the end of World War I. Striking workers were demanding ever higher wages, and manufacturers were giving in to demands and raising prices, while the German central bank was all too happy to print more money. This inflation had some positive effects in that it made German exports more attractive on the global market. But when French and Belgian troops decided that Germany was not properly paying reparations, they occupied the industrial Ruhr region to extract their own reparations. The German government organized passive resistance against the occupying armies. They encouraged workers to strike and offered strikers and companies monetary compensation by printing more German currency. Suddenly, inflation had gotten so out of control that prices for even basic things like food could change dramatically in a single day. In October 1922, $1 would buy 3,180 marks. By November 1923, a single US dollar would be worth 4.2 trillion marks. This situation wiped out Germany's middle class by making their savings worthless and led to widespread hunger. Eventually, a new head of Germany's central bank brought inflation under control by pegging the mark to land assets, but not before one more right-wing attempt to overthrow the government. This was the Beer Hall Putsch, and was led by Adolf Hitler, with involvement from Erich Ludendorff, who we met at the beginning. Despite 4 dead police officers, Hitler was given only a 15-month sentence, later reduced to 9 months. During this time, he compiled an incoherent book that laid out his vision for Germany and the world, called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. But it wasn't Hitler's turn quite yet. Instead, things started to look better for the Weimar Republic, as cooler heads prevailed on the subject of reparations, and the economy started to improve in what came to be known as the Happy 20s.